Hormuz was supposed to be the switch Iran could flip. One warning, one closure claim, one flash of naval pressure, and the world's oil arteries were supposed to seize up. That was the fear. That was the image. A narrow strip of water turning into a chokehold around the global economy. But then something happened that makes the story much more dangerous. The oil kept moving. Not perfectly, not safely, not normally in the full sense of the word, but it moved. And according to Reuters, U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said that roughly 20 million barrels of oil had exited the Strait of Hormuz in a single 24-hour window, carried by 72 ships. Now pause there. 20 million barrels is not a footnote. That is close to 1/5 of daily global oil consumption passing through a contested maritime throat, while governments were still arguing over who controlled it, who could tax it, who could threaten it, and who had the power to keep it open. That is why the public debate is asking the wrong question. The question is not simply whether Iran closed Hormuz. The question is whether Iran can still make the world believe Hormuz is closable at a price the world cannot bear. Because there is a difference between closing a door and making everyone afraid to walk through it. There is a difference between blocking a road and poisoning the confidence of every driver who might use it. And in Hormuz, confidence is not a feeling. Confidence is fuel, insurance, crew safety, military escort, shipping schedules, and price. Look at the timing. Iran had tried to turn Hormuz back into a weapon of political gravity. The message was simple. If the region burns, the world economy burns with it. If Iran is pressured, the Gulf does not stay open for free. If Washington wants stability, Washington must negotiate with the hand that rests near the valve. But the response was not just a speech. The response was movement. Reuters reported that ships were avoiding the main traffic separation scheme because of mine concerns. Some were moving closer to the Iranian coast. Others were using southern routes near Oman. Military escorts became part of the picture. Oman opened temporary lanes. The International Maritime Organization was involved in emergency coordination. And suddenly, the real contest was not being fought in slogans. It was being fought in routes. The question is not what they said. The question is what they moved. This is where the official story begins to crack. On the surface, Iran could still say it had leverage. Tehran could still claim that it had the authority to regulate movement through the strait. It could still talk about law, registration, fees, maritime safety, and sovereignty. All of that sounds bureaucratic. All of that sounds calm. But bureaucracy can be a weapon when it sits on top of oil. A fee is not always a fee. Sometimes it is a political checkpoint dressed in accounting clothes. A registration system is not always a safety measure. Sometimes it is a list of who obeyed, who hesitated, and who dared to pass without permission. That is the deeper fight. Hormuz did not need to become an iron gate to become a pressure machine. It only needed to become uncertain. It only needed to become a place where captains slowed down, insurers raised premiums, crews demanded evacuation plans, and traders began pricing fear into every barrel. And for a moment that almost worked. The Financial Times reported, based on satellite analysis, that hundreds of large tanker-sized vessels were waiting outside the Gulf, clustered near Sohar and Fujairah. Even if the exact operational condition changed by the hour, the image matters. A floating parking lot outside the world's energy artery. That is not normal commerce. That is a market holding its breath. AP framed the same crisis differently. It did not just focus on barrels. It focused on the future of Hormuz itself. It reported that more ships were venturing through, but the deeper issue remained unsettled. Who would manage the strait? What Iran would demand? Whether fees would return? And whether the temporary calm would survive the next political shock? That is the part they do not want to explain. Because the crisis was never only about a physical closure. It was about the creation of a new toll booth in the imagination of global trade. I want you to think of Hormuz as a narrow hallway inside a burning building. Iran does not need to brick up the hallway to create panic. It can dim the lights. It can scatter glass on the floor. It can tell everyone there might be smoke behind the next door. It can make every person who passes through wonder whether the next step is safe. And then the United States enters the hallway with a flashlight, a radio, and an escort team. That does not mean the building is safe. It means the panic has competition. This is the model I want you to keep in your head. The valve, the escort, and the invoice. The valve is Iran's leverage. Hormuz is one of the few places on Earth where geography itself gives a country strategic weight beyond its economic size. If Tehran can credibly threaten the valve, it can force the world to listen. The escort is America's counter-leverage. Washington does not have to erase every risk. It has to make the risk manageable enough for ships to move and markets to calm. The escort is not just protection. It is a message in steel. The route is dangerous, but not abandoned. The invoice is the next battlefield. Because after the immediate question of safety comes the quieter question of cost. Who pays? Who registers? Who insures? Who recognizes whose authority? Who gets to say that passage through a vital international waterway now requires new permissions? Follow the money, then follow the fear. Reuters reported that oil prices fell after tankers started exiting the strait. Brent and WTI moved lower because markets saw movement. Not peace, not trust. Movement that matters because markets do not always wait for official declarations. They read flows like a cardiogram. On a tanker leaving Hormuz is a heartbeat. On a tanker waiting outside the Gulf is a skipped beat. On a tanker needing escort is a heartbeat under stress. And when enough ships moved, the market began to believe that Iran's threat had limits. That belief may be temporary, it may be fragile, it may be reversed by a single incident. But for a strategic actor, perception is not decoration. Perception is battlefield terrain. Now look at Iran's problem. If Iran actually closes Hormuz completely, it risks turning every oil importing power against it. China, India, Europe, Japan, Gulf producers, shipping firms, insurers, all of them would be forced to react. A complete closure is not just pressure on America, it is pressure on almost everyone. That is a dangerous coalition to awaken. But if Iran only threatens closure or creates enough uncertainty to slow flows, it can preserve deniability. It can say it is enforcing safety. It can say it is responding to war. It can say it is managing an emergency. It can create friction without accepting full responsibility for an economic shock. That is why the gray zone matters. Hormuz is not a simple switch. It is a dimmer. Iran can raise or lower the pressure without always flipping the system into total darkness. A few warnings, a few altered routes, a few mines, a few registration demands, a few days of tanker hesitation that can create billions of dollars in anxiety without a formal blockade. But America understands that game. That is why the escorts mattered. Not because an escort makes a mine disappear. Not because a naval presence guarantees safety. Not because Washington can magically erase geography. The escort mattered because it attacked the psychological center of Iran's pressure campaign. Iran wanted the world to imagine Hormuz as frozen. The United States wanted the world to watch ships move. That is not a coincidence. Every ship that passed through under protection weakened the image of Iranian control. Every barrel that exited the Gulf told traders that the valve had not been fully captured. Every route open near Oman showed that the maritime map still had options. This is how strategic messaging works when it becomes physical. A press conference says one thing. A convoy says it louder. A falling oil price says it louder still. But here is the uncomfortable part. America did not prove Hormuz was safe. It proved that Hormuz was usable under pressure. Those are not the same thing. Safe means routine. Safe means predictable. Safe means insurers sleep at night, crews stay on board, shipping firms stop rerouting, and no one needs emergency coordination from the International Maritime Organization. Usable means you can get through if the strongest military power in the world helps hold the door open. That is a much darker sentence. The IMO's evacuation plan for more than 11,000 seafarers trapped or exposed in the region tells you what the calm public language cannot. If everything were truly normal, you would not need that kind of plan. You would not need assurances from multiple governments. You would not need a humanitarian maritime back channel operating behind the energy headlines. That is the human layer beneath the barrel count. Every time analysts talk about oil flows, they risk turning sailors into invisible cargo. But ships do not move themselves. Crews have to trust that the route will not become a graveyard, a bargaining chip, or a political trap. When seafarers need evacuation planning, the crisis has not ended. It has merely changed shape. Now pause there. This is the central contradiction of the Hormuz crisis. The same evidence that proves the route is open also proves the route is dangerous. If 20 million barrels move through in 24 hours, that shows the energy system can still breathe. But if ships needed alternate lanes, military escort, mine caution, and emergency coordination, that shows the breathing is strained. And the official story wants a clean answer, open or closed. The real answer is uglier, open but militarized, flowing but nervous, profitable but exposed. That is how modern chokepoint warfare works. It does not always announce itself with a blockade. Sometimes it arrives as a delay, sometimes as a premium, sometimes as a route adjustment, sometimes as a captain waiting outside port because the next mile of water has become a geopolitical courtroom. Iran's strategic interest is obvious. It needs to remind Washington that pressure on Tehran has consequences beyond Tehran. It needs to show that American and Israeli action in the region can create pain for global markets. It needs to preserve the idea that any final settlement must account for Iran's capacity to disrupt. But Iran also needs to avoid overplaying the hand. If the strait freezes completely, Iran becomes the author of global energy panic. If the strait remains too open, Iran's leverage looks hollow. So Tehran is trapped between two dangers, doing too much and doing too little. That is where the U.S. escort strategy becomes so powerful. It does not force Iran into immediate surrender. It does something subtler. It narrows the space where Iran can profit from ambiguity. It says, you can threaten, but we will move ships. You can create fear, but we will create routes. You can talk about control, but we will produce evidence of flow. That evidence is visual. Tankers moving through Hormuz are not just commerce. They are floating arguments. Each one says the strait has not been fully captured by Iran's narrative. Each one says the market can still function. Each one says the threat is real but not decisive. And that is why the title matters. Hormuz nearly froze again, then U.S. escorts arrived. The word nearly is doing serious work. It does not claim a total shutdown. It captures the functional freeze, the hesitation, the waiting vessels, the slowed transit, the fear of mines, the uncertainty about fees, the rerouting, the suspended confidence. Then the escorts arrived. Again, we have to be precise. The reporting points to military escorts and U.S. military support in helping oil move out of the Gulf. It does not mean every escorted ship was guarded by an American vessel alone. It means the broader security architecture around the strait shifted from panic management to forced movement. That distinction matters, because exaggeration makes analysis weak. The stronger argument is not that America magically saved every ship. The stronger argument is that the U.S.-backed security framework helped puncture Iran's attempt to turn uncertainty into paralysis. That is much harder to dismiss. Now let us deal with the strongest counterargument. A smart critic would say this entire interpretation gives Washington too much credit. They would argue that Iran never intended a full closure, that the traffic data shows ships were still passing, that the talk of freezing Hormuz was media drama, and that oil prices fell because traders had already priced in the limits of Iran's threat. That argument deserves respect, because it contains truth. Iran may not have wanted a full closure. A full closure would damage its own interests and alienate major buyers. Traffic never stopped completely. And yes, markets often react less to dramatic statements than to physical supply data. But that counter-argument cannot explain the whole picture. It cannot explain why ships avoided normal lanes. It cannot explain why hundreds of vessels waited outside the Gulf. It cannot explain why mine concerns shaped routing. It cannot explain why emergency seafarer evacuation planning was necessary. It cannot explain why the question of fees, registration, and future management of Hormuz became central immediately after the flow resumed. Most importantly, it cannot explain why both sides fought so hard over the meaning of movement. If nothing serious had happened, Wright would not need to emphasize 20 million barrels exiting in 24 hours. AP would not focus on the unsettled future of the strait. The IMO would not be coordinating emergency measures. Reuters would not be tracking the difference between normal traffic and stress traffic. The evidence says the crisis was real. But it was not the kind of crisis television prefers. Television likes explosions. Markets fear uncertainty. Governments fear precedent. Shipping firms fear legal ambiguity. Crews fear being trapped between flags, mines, and missiles. Hormuz became all of those at once. Here's the part they do not want to explain. If Iran can normalize a system where ships must register, pay, reroute, or seek special arrangements during regional crises, then Hormuz changes from an international artery into a negotiable pressure point. That may sound technical. It is not. It would mean that future crises begin from a new baseline. Today's temporary fee becomes tomorrow's administrative expectation. Today's emergency route becomes tomorrow's strategic habit. Today's escort becomes tomorrow's proof that civilian trade cannot move without military shadow. And once trade needs military shadow, the world has already changed. This is why the next 48 to 72 hours matter. The crisis is not over when oil moves. The crisis is over when oil moves without fear, and we are not there yet. Watch the first signal, daily transit volume through Hormuz compared with pre-war averages. If traffic climbs toward the old range of roughly 100 to 130 vessels per day without heavy escort language, the freeze narrative weakens. If volume stalls below normal, Iran's gray zone pressure remains alive. Watch the second signal, the status of mines, routing, and insurance. If ships return to the main traffic lanes and insurers stop pricing exceptional risk, confidence is recovering. If vessels keep hugging alternative routes near Oman or avoiding standard lanes, the strait is open only in the most fragile sense. Watch the third signal, Iran's 60-day position on fees, registration, or maritime authority. If Tehran quietly backs down, its leverage has been damaged. If it rebrands tolls as service fees, insurance charges, or safety registration, then the next Hormuz crisis has already begun before the last one has ended. Exactly three signals. Traffic. Risk. Authority. That is the triangle. And now the deeper question emerges. Who actually won this round? If you judge by headlines, Iran scared the world and America responded. If you judge by barrels, the United States helped keep the oil moving. If you judge by legal positioning, Iran may still be trying to shift the long-term rules of the waterway. If you judge by market psychology, the answer is temporary and unstable. The real winner may not be a country. The real winner may be the model of crisis itself. A model where no one fully closes the strait, but everyone pays as if it might close. A model where war is not declared, but trade moves like it is being watched through a rifle scope. A model where every barrel carries a small tax of fear. That is the world Hormuz just revealed. Not a world where geography is destiny. A world where geography becomes leverage only when fear makes it believable. The United States did not erase Iran's position. Iran still sits beside the choke point. Iran still has geography. Iran still has missiles, mines, naval assets, political will, and the ability to create uncertainty. No serious analysis should pretend otherwise. But Iran also something brutal. A threat is only as powerful as the world's belief in it. And once tankers begin moving under escort, once prices begin falling, once the image of paralysis breaks, the threat does not disappear, but it starts leaking air. That is what happened in Hormuz. The valve did not fully close. The hallway did not fully clear. The invoice has not been settled. And that is why this story is far bigger than one day of oil shipments. It is a preview of how future choke point crises will be fought, not only with ships and mines, but with routes, data, insurance, press statements, satellite images, and the psychology of markets. The next war over Hormuz may not begin with a missile. It may begin with a form. A registration form, a safety notice, a routing advisory, a new fee, a temporary emergency measure that somehow becomes permanent. And when that happens, the world will ask the same shallow question again. Is Hormuz open or closed? But you will know the better question. Who is making the world pay to believe it is still open? Because in the end, power is not always the ability to shut the gate. Sometimes power is the ability to make everyone ask permission before walking through it.